Adele challenged Amy Winehouse about being old-fashioned. What happened next changed both their careers forever. March 2008, BBC Radio 1 Studios, London. The building hummed with its usual pre-show energy, producers rushing between soundproof booths, engineers adjusting levels, presenters rehearsing their links. But today felt different. Two of Britain's most talked about voices were scheduled for back-to-back interviews with Joe Wiley. Adele arrived first. At 19, she was the music industry's golden newcomer. Her debut album 19 had just been released to critical acclaim and surprising commercial success. Critics were calling her the future of British soul, a young artist who could bridge traditional vocals with contemporary pop sensibilities. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd been told repeatedly that she was special. The green room was small, corporate beige walls decorated with framed photos of Radio 1's biggest moments. Adele sat reviewing her talking points with her manager, occasionally glancing at the door. She knew Amy Winehouse was coming. Everyone in the building knew Amy Winehouse was coming. Amy arrived 20 minutes later, quiet and unassuming. She wore a simple black dress, her signature beehive hair perfectly constructed, but somehow effortless. She moved through the corridor without fanfare, nodding politely to staff members who tried to catch her attention. There was something magnetic about her presence, not demanding attention, but impossible to ignore. Her manager spoke in hushed tones with the producers, while Amy found a corner chair and sat down, checking her phone with the same casual focus she might bring to any ordinary moment. "Amy?" Adele stood up, extending her hand. "I'm Adele. Huge fan of your work." Amy looked up, smiled genuinely. "Adele, yeah. Heard your record. Beautiful voice." They shook hands. The room's energy shifted slightly. Two artists, different generations, despite being only 5 years apart. Different approaches to the same musical heritage. "Your sound is so authentic," Adele continued, settling back into her chair. "But I've been thinking about where soul music is headed, you know? The industry's changing so fast." Amy nodded, listening. "I mean, the Motown sound, the jazz influences, that whole retro approach," Adele gestured vaguely. "It's beautiful, but it's quite old-fashioned, isn't it? Modern audiences want something more contemporary, more accessible. Real modern pop needs to speak to today's world, not yesterday's." Amy's expression didn't change. She continued listening, no defensive reaction, no immediate rebuttal, just attention. "Don't get me wrong," Adele added quickly, perhaps sensing she'd overstepped. "Your voice is incredible, but the arrangements, the production style, it's very throwback. I think the future is about keeping that soul foundation, but making it relevant for radio, for streaming, for how people actually consume music now." Amy smiled slightly. "You might be right." The producer's voice crackled through the intercom. "Amy, we're ready for you in Studio 1. Amy stood up, smoothed her dress. "Nice meeting you, Adele. Good luck with your interview." Studio 1 was Radio 1's flagship booth, all glass and modern equipment, designed to make artists feel both intimate and important. Joe Wiley was already seated, headphones on, running through her introduction cards. Amy settled into the guest chair, adjusted her headphones with practiced ease, tested the microphone levels. Through the glass partition, staff members gathered gradually. Word had spread that Amy Winehouse was in the building. Engineers, other presenters, even security guards found reasons to walk past Studio 1. Everyone wanted to witness something, though nobody could articulate what they expected to happen. Adele finished her interview in Studio 2 and was walking toward the exit when she heard something that made her stop. Music coming from Studio 1. Not a recording, not a backing track. Live vocals, raw and unprocessed, cutting through the building's background noise. She changed direction, moving toward the growing crowd outside Studio 1. Inside the booth, Joe Wiley had just finished her interview questions. Standard stuff about Amy's upcoming projects, her influences, her writing process. Amy had answered thoughtfully, but without particular energy. Then, almost as an afterthought, Joe had said, "Would you mind giving us a little something live? Just acoustic?" Amy had nodded, reached for the guitar sitting in the corner. "What would you like to hear?" "Anything." Whatever feels right. Amy had tuned the guitar quickly, professionally, her fingers finding the tension points without conscious thought. Then she'd started playing Valerie. But this wasn't the Valerie anyone in that building knew. This wasn't the Mark Ronson-produced version that had dominated radio stations. This wasn't even the Zootons original. This was something else entirely. Amy's voice cut through the studio monitors with surgical precision. No auto-tune, no reverb, no digital enhancement. Just breath and vocal cords and decades of musical intuition compressed into 4 minutes of devastating simplicity. She sang the opening lines. Well, sometimes I go out by myself and I look across the water, and immediately everyone listening understood they were witnessing something profound. Her voice carried weight that couldn't be manufactured, experience that couldn't be studied, authenticity that couldn't be coached. Adele stood frozen outside the studio door, her earlier words echoing in her mind. Old-fashioned, throwback, not relevant for modern audiences. Amy's interpretation of Valerie was simultaneously ancient and timeless. She found pockets of melody in the song that the original writers probably never intended. Vocal runs that felt inevitable rather than showy. Emotional depths that transformed a relatively simple pop song into something approaching high art. Every note seemed to carry years of lived experience. Pain transformed into beauty through the alchemy of her voice. Her guitar playing was economical, purposeful. Every chord change served the story. Every string bend supported the vocal. Nothing flashy, nothing unnecessary. Pure musical communication that seemed to bypass the brain and speak directly to the heart. The crowd outside Studio One had grown larger. Producers had stopped working. Other presenters had left their booths. Everyone sensed they were experiencing something rare. Amy's voice climbed through the bridge, not straining, not pushing, but expanding naturally like breathing in reverse. She held notes not because she could, but because the song demanded it. Her vibrato was controlled, musical, never ornamental. And I would go out tonight, but I haven't got a stitch to wear, she sang, and somehow made a throwaway line about clothing feel like existential poetry. Adele felt something cracking inside her chest. This wasn't old-fashioned. This wasn't irrelevant. This was the opposite of everything she'd convinced herself about contemporary music. Amy reached the final chorus, her voice now stripped of everything except pure intention. No tricks, no vocal gymnastics, no desperate reaches for impressive notes. Just truth, delivered through melody, supported by rhythm, honest as breathing. When she finished, the studio fell completely silent. Joe Wiley sat motionless, her mouth slightly open. The engineers in the control booth had stopped moving. The crowd outside the door stood perfectly still, some with tears they weren't aware they were crying. Amy set down the guitar, adjusted her headphones, looked at Joe. That work? Joe nodded slowly, still processing what she'd just heard. Amy, that was extraordinary. Amy smiled, shrugged slightly. Just a song. The interview wrapped up quickly after that. Amy answered a few more questions, thanked Joe for having her, gathered her things, and walked out of the studio as quietly as she'd arrived. The crowd parted as she moved through them. People wanted to say something, to acknowledge what they'd just witnessed, but words felt inadequate. Amy nodded politely, made brief eye contact, continued toward the exit. Adele was still standing near Studio One when Amy passed her. Amy, Adele called softly. Amy stopped, turned back. Adele struggled for words. That was perfect. Amy's smile was genuine, without any trace of superiority or vindication. Thanks. Your interview went well? Adele nodded, though she could barely remember what she'd said on air. Yeah, fine. Listen, what you just did in there? Just playing a song, Amy said simply. No, it was more than that. Adele paused, searching for accuracy rather than politeness. That was what I've been trying to do my whole career. Amy looked at her kindly. You've got a beautiful voice, Adele, trust it. And then she was gone, walking down the corridor with that same unhurried pace she'd brought to everything that afternoon, disappearing into the London afternoon like she'd never been there at all. But the building felt different in her absence, charged with the residual energy of something profound. She left behind a group of people who would spend years trying to process what they'd just experienced, trying to understand how 4 minutes could reshape everything they thought they knew about music. Adele stood alone outside Studio One, staring at the empty space where Amy had been. Everything she thought she knew about modern music, about commercial viability, about what audiences wanted, was reshuffling in her mind. Joe Wiley emerged from the booth, still looking dazed. "Did you hear that?" "Yeah," Adele whispered. "I heard it. In 20 years of radio, I've never heard anything like that. She just took that song and made it completely her own. No preparation, no rehearsal, just pure musical instinct." Adele nodded, unable to speak. That evening, Adele went home to her small flat in Tottenham and sat at her piano for hours. She played through songs from 19, trying to understand what she'd heard that afternoon, trying to identify what Amy had that she was missing. Technical skill? Adele knew she had that. Vocal range? Hers was impressive. Stage presence? She'd been building that. But something about Amy's performance had rendered all those considerations irrelevant. Amy's voice hadn't been trying to impress anyone. It had been trying to tell the truth. Over the following weeks, Adele found herself returning obsessively to that 4-minute performance. She'd requested a copy of the recording from BBC and listened to it repeatedly, studying Amy's choices, her restraint, her absolute commitment to serving the song rather than showcasing her abilities. Each listen revealed new layers: the way Amy had breathed between phrases, the subtle timing variations that made the rhythm feel alive, the courage to let silence exist between words. Slowly, Adele began to understand what she'd witnessed. Amy hadn't been performing for the audience, for the radio listeners, for the industry critics or chart positions. She'd been communicating directly with the song itself, finding its emotional center and amplifying it without ego, without agenda, without concern for how it might be received or whether it fit current market demands. This realization began changing how Adele approached her own music. Her second album, 21, would reflect this shift. Less concern with contemporary trends, more focus on emotional honesty. Less calculation about commercial appeal, more trust in the timeless power of authentic expression. The sessions for 21 were different from 19. Adele found herself stripping away layers rather than adding them, looking for the essential emotional core of each song rather than the most impressive vocal moments. Someone Like You emerged from this new approach. A simple piano ballad, no tricks, no vocal acrobatics, just raw emotion delivered through melody. The song that would define her career came directly from the lesson Amy had taught her that afternoon in the BBC studios. When Amy died in July 2011, just 3 months after 21 was released, Adele was devastated. She'd planned to tell Amy about the influence that Radio 1 performance had on her work, to thank her for the unintentional masterclass in musical authenticity. Instead, she found herself talking about Amy in interviews, trying to articulate what that brief encounter had meant to her career. "Amy taught me something I didn't even know I needed to learn," Adele told Rolling Stone in 2012. "I thought I understood what it meant to be authentic, but I was still thinking about how to be authentic, which automatically makes it less authentic." Amy just was. She didn't perform authenticity, she lived it. The interviewer asked about their meeting at Radio 1. "I said some really stupid things to her that day," Adele admitted. "I was young and thought I knew where music was heading. I told her that her style was old-fashioned, that modern audiences wanted something more contemporary. I was essentially telling one of the greatest artists of our generation that she was doing it wrong." How did she respond? She listened. She didn't argue, didn't defend herself, didn't get offended. She just listened, like she was genuinely considering what I was saying. Then she went into that studio and played Valerie and completely destroyed every assumption I had about music. "In what way?" Adele was quiet for a long moment. "She showed me that there's no such thing as old-fashioned when you're dealing with pure emotion. Fear, love, heartbreak, hope. Those aren't trends. They don't go out of style." Amy understood that. She wasn't making retro music. She was making human music. And human music is always contemporary because humans are always contemporary. Did that change how you approached your own work? Everything changed after that. I stopped worrying about what was commercial, what was modern, what would work on radio. I started asking myself, what's true? What do I actually feel? How can I express that as honestly as possible? That's what Amy did. She found truth and then she sang it without apology, without compromise. Years later, when Adele became one of the biggest selling artists in the world, she would often reference that afternoon at Radio 1 as a turning point, not just in her career, but in her understanding of what music could be. People talk about Amy's technical abilities, her voice, her songwriting, Adele said in a 2015 interview. All of that was incredible, but what made her special was her complete lack of artifice. She couldn't be anything other than exactly who she was. In a world full of calculated career moves and strategic artistic decisions, Amy was just herself, always. And that's the hardest thing to be. The story of that March afternoon in 2008 became part of music industry folklore. The young, ambitious Adele challenging the established Amy Winehouse about relevance and modernity, only to be shown the timeless power of authentic artistic expression. But for Adele, it was never about being proven wrong. It was about being shown a better way forward. I'm grateful for that conversation, she said years later. I'm grateful for my own ignorance that day, because it led to Amy showing me something I couldn't have learned any other way. She taught me that the best music doesn't chase the moment, it creates moments, and those moments last forever. Amy Winehouse never knew the impact that 4-minute performance had on Adele's career. She never knew that her simple, unguarded response to a young artist's challenge would help shape some of the most successful songs of the following decade. But maybe that was exactly the point. Amy wasn't performing to teach lessons or prove points. She was just being Amy, singing songs, trusting that honesty would find its way to whoever needed to hear it. And on that March afternoon in 2008, in a small radio studio in London, it did.